So this stream will be a little bit shorter than our normal stream because it is part of Unit 7, and we will be covering international trade, changes in the global economy, the post-industrial landscape, and we will be ending with a fake news kind of scenario where you can take a break from multiple choice and FRQs instead, and we can do this fun scenario instead. So trade. There are two aspects of trade. One of them is called complementarity, and the other one is called comparative advantage. So trade happens when one group wants a certain good or service, and then the other group is willing to give it up, usually for another good or service in return. The word trade usually reminds you of the barter system where you would give up 3 chickens for a goat or something, but modern trade, we don't really do that. We use money and credit instead. And as I talked about, one feature of trade is complementarity. So that basically means that both parties have to have goods and services that the other party desires. So I don't know, let's use these markers. So country A has blue markers, country B has red markers. Country A wants to color in red sometimes too, so they want some of country B's red markers. And then country B wants to color in blue sometimes, so they want some of country A's blue markers. So trade will happen here. But if country A wants the red markers and country B doesn't want blue markers, trade won't happen. So that's called complementarity. And another thing that needs to happen for trade to occur is comparative advantage. And that basically means that whoever is exporting the good has to produce it more efficiently than whoever is purchasing the good. So if I produced, I don't know, pens, I could produce 10 pens in an hour, and someone else could produce 15 pens in an hour. I'm going to trade because they can produce a lot more pens in the same amount of time. But if I can produce 10 pens in an hour and someone else can only do 2, I'm not going to trade because I can do it more efficiently and I can do it myself. So complementarity and comparative advantage are the two key terms that you need to remember for trade. And one example of this is the Florida and Idaho orange potato trade. And you know that Florida is known for its oranges and Idaho is known for its potatoes. And Florida has the super sunny and warm weather, and oranges grow well here. And Idaho has the perfect climate and soil for cultivating potatoes. So people in Florida obviously want potatoes, people in Idaho want oranges. So this leads to Florida and Idaho conducting trade because the features of complementarity and comparative advantage were fulfilled. So globalization has led to international trade expanding even more. Nowadays, we have bigger ports, larger ships, and more efficient planes. So trade has become even easier, and both of them build on each other. So globalization has led to the spread of technology, and with this technology, we can trade more and we can trade faster. In the past, we couldn't trade with faraway countries because we didn't have the proper infrastructure. Now we do, and now we can trade. We have the ability to, and yeah. So these are some important international trade relationships that you need to know, and you've probably heard about them covered in the news before, and you've probably seen them around, but these are the ones that are covered in the AP Human curriculum. So the first one is NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's an agreement entered into by Canada, Mexico, and the United States to eliminate trade barriers and facilitate the movement of goods and services between the countries. So NAFTA basically makes it easier for products to cross borders and it grows the economy. And next is Mercosur. So it basically has the same fundamental basis, and it promotes free trade and free flow of goods, people, and currency between Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and even Brazil. And right now, Venezuela is kind of on probation from Mercosur, even though it is a member because of the state of its economy. Next is the World Trade Organization, and it's a global organization that deals with trade between the majority of nations. So it's kind of like an overarching organization that overlooks all trade that happens between countries, and I believe around 160 countries are a part of it right now. So it's pretty good. And Yeah, it's really important for like solving like disputes between countries over trade because it's kind of like an overarching thing. Next is OPEC, and this is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And this is an intergovernmental organization made of oil-producing nations, including Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, Libya, Kuwait, Qatar, and some more countries. And they are very influential. This organization is probably the most important trade relationship that exists in general. And what they do is they maintain and stabilize international crude oil prices. So OPEC is the fundamental resource for every country because every country relies on crude oil and fossil fuels to power everything, just produce electricity, fuel cars, whatnot. So they're very important. And when something happens with them, the whole world gets affected. So they're very influential. Lastly, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and this is ASEAN, and they promote economic stability and growth between its members, which includes Indonesia, Thailand, Myanmar, Singapore, and some more Southeast Asian countries. I believe Cambodia is in there too. And these free trade agreements and organization, they contribute to even more globalization, which has its costs and benefits. And I'm sure there's a stream on globalization that you can check out the replay on. And trade relationships like go hand in hand with globalization because of what we said before, the technology and like products being exchanged across international borders. It all just like builds up into this like ongoing cycle. So this is outsourcing and economic restructuring. And this diagram just shows factories being moved from the United States to Cambodia. And this is also known as deindustrialization, and this is basically a process by which companies move industrial jobs to other regions with cheaper labor, leaving the newly deindustrialized region to switch to a service economy and to work through a period of high unemployment. So now, because of deindustrialization, you have factories moving to developing countries away from these highly developed countries. And what happens when factories move? Unemployment happens in the country where the factory was taken out of. And this leads to a lot of other consequences. And the countries where the factories are relocated to are often known as NICs, or newly industrialized countries. And the reason that outsourcing and economic restructuring works so well is because of the infrastructure we have in place today. So improved communications, transportation, all of those factors, they lead to developed countries having their managing offices there, like the headquarters, and they have their manufacturing and their factories in developing countries, and they can communicate back and forth, and they can transport product back and forth because of the infrastructure we have today. Okay, so these are transnationals and export processing zones. So transnational corporations, they're very large companies that span across multiple countries, and they usually move their manufacturing jobs to less developed countries. They contribute to the process of deindustrialization, basically. And in these less developed countries, workers usually have lower wages, and this helps these transnational corporations make even more money. And businesses, their goal is to make profit. So the process of moving factories overseas and outsourcing, that's the term for it, that further increases the profits of transnationals, and that just like helps them grow. They also automate a lot of jobs to save even more money. So they replace workers with machines and robots, basically, and that harms the workers, but it benefits the consumers because products are being produced much more efficiently, and that leads to cheaper prices as well. Transnational companies also move overseas to take advantage of less strict laws concerning workers' rights and the environment. So usually these big factories, they produce a lot of toxic byproducts, chemical waste, and pollution. And when they move overseas, they're less likely to be fined and regulated for all of this pollution and all of the waste that they produce. So it just convinces them to move overseas even more. And they also don't have to focus on workers' rights as much, because if they're in these less developed countries, the countries are more focused on developing themselves rather than pinpointing on specific worker problems and stuff. So they have to spend less money on like HR and management of like workers. So that just leads to transnationals being more and more convinced to just move overseas and outsource labor instead of staying in the country where they started. And developing countries also use pull factors known as EPZs, or export processing zones, to attract foreign businesses and transnational corporations to put their factories there. They want more factories in their country because it helps boost their economy. Because when products are produced in your country, it boosts your gross domestic product, or GDP. So they want the factories there. And these zones also have regulations that greatly benefit transnationals, and these are even more reasons to come there. So some of these regulations and benefits include like tax breaks. So the companies don't have to pay taxes for any resources that they import as long as they're used to export products. So I don't know, if I'm making mattresses overseas, if I get feathers, springs, and cloth imported, I don't have to pay any money as long as those three resources are used in my mattresses, which are being exported right out. So they're saving money that way, and that's another pull factor. And as you can see in these pictures, these zones are called Maquiladoras in Mexico and special economic zones in China. And EPZs are usually near ports and borders for easy export. So they're usually like right next to the port. So anything like raw resources and materials can just be imported straight into the factory, and any like the finished product can be exported straight out. So EPZs also have a lot of pros and cons, obviously. So some advantages include like people in these countries getting access to higher wages than they would in the rest of their country. So let's take Mexican maquiladoras, for example. So there was this documentary that showed workers in those factories, and they said that they were being paid more in the maquiladoras than they were in their domestic factories. So they were actually getting higher wages, even though the companies are paying the Mexican factory workers a lot less than they would pay American factory workers if they hadn't relocated. But it's actually kind of beneficial for the workers if they get higher wages. And the low costs of outsourcing labor allows low-income people to afford the product. So when transnational corporations can save money on producing their product, they're going to be able to lower prices. And that means that people who don't make as much can afford those products. And lastly, women become independent and can make their own money. So I know in Maquiladoras, a lot of women work there as well. So they're able to make their own wages, and they can become self-sustainable and independent, and they don't have to depend on their spouse as much. And what results from transnationals and EPZs are something called the new international division of labor. And basically, this just categorizes the different economic sectors that different countries concentrate their production in. And I believe Harrison will do a future stream where he covers each of these sectors in detail, but I'll just go over the gist. So core countries such as like the US and Germany, they focus all of their like time on research and development. So like those upper tier production things. Semi-periphery countries such as China and India, they usually manufacture goods which go to the core countries. And periphery countries such as I believe Cambodia and then Mali, they extract minerals and natural resources which go to the semi-periphery countries to be manufactured with. So I don't know, let's take phones, for example. So the periphery countries will extract the quartz, the sand, the silica, the minerals, and metals that are needed to make a phone, and then they ship them to factories in semi-periphery countries, which then turn all of these materials into a phone. and then the phone is shipped to the core countries to be sold there. So that's the general flow of goods. And this is interdependency. So as economies become more and more connected, partially because of globalization and trade, they start becoming interdependent, which basically means that they rely on each other to function. And interdependency also has its costs and benefits. So some pros are that microlending and international lending agencies such as the International Monetary Fund can help countries pick themselves up and revitalize their economy. So if a country is facing a recession, they need money to reboost themselves and get themselves up. So if they rely on another nation, they can they can borrow money and then they can boost their economy again and then eventually pay back the loan. And if a country doesn't have the facilities to produce a certain good or service, if I don't have the metal to produce jewelry, I could rely on another country to give it to me, and we could start producing that good. And then lastly, it boosts the global economy and the marketplace. So when everyone is trading and communicating, transporting, it just grows the economy as a whole, and it fosters good trade relationships and good relationships between countries in general. Interdependency also has disadvantages. So when countries start relying on each other way too much, they start becoming self-sustainable in terms of resources and money, such as during times of deficits and debt crises. So if I relied on country X for technology, for example, and suddenly country X places tariffs, they don't want to trade, something happens, I don't have access to technology anymore. I need to find another country or a trade partner to foster trade again because I don't have access, because I was so reliant on one country. And another thing is that a bad economy in one country can lead to other countries having economic problems. So if the country that you rely on for something has a lot of problems, it's not good for you either. So this is an example of this was in 2014 when oil prices dropped a lot. So this goes back to OPEC with the crude oil. So when oil prices dropped significantly, workers lost their jobs. People in other industries were also affected. People around the world, like oil companies and coal companies, they started crashing because the prices weren't enough to keep up with the costs of production, and that just spiraled out of control. But thankfully, we're back on track again with the oil prices, which is good. But that's just an example of interdependency. So consumers in developed countries consume a lot more goods and services because they have a lot of disposable income. So consumption has obviously changed a lot over the years. People in developed countries have a lot more access to money that they can spend on resources as compared to people in less developed countries. And this is a picture of the world map, and it is taken from the AMSCO AP Human textbook. And you can see that they use British thermal units, which is a measure of energy. And you can see these super dark areas, which is Australia, the United States, and Russia, China. And this is how much energy the people in these countries consume per year. And in the less developed countries, like countries in Africa and Brazil, Mexico, they're using under 74 million British thermal units. So this is an example of a stimulus question that you might see in your FRQs. It obviously won't be under this topic because it is part of Unit 7, but it's an example of a stimulus. And a fun fact is that the US only contains 1/20th of the global population, but it consumes 1/5 of all global resources, which is shocking because we consume so much energy by ourselves, and people in less developed countries don't have the same access, so they don't have enough resources. So when you're having all these things happening, the deindustrialization, outsourcing, trade, it leads the landscape to change. when you're moving from the industrial to a post-industrial economy. So on the left, you can see a brownfield, and this is basically characterized by abandoned factories with rusty metal, broken windows, graffiti, weeds. You might have seen this around. And basically, all these factories were just abandoned when labor was outsourced to another country. And in the Northeast and the Great Lakes area, like near Michigan and that area, it was called the Rust Belt because all of the rusting of old car factories happened, and then it was called the Rust Belt after that. And factories can also be renovated or repurposed, or they can be completely demolished and replaced with parks, malls, corporate parks, or new housing. So sometimes when you like completely remove the factory, you have no idea that the factory was even there. And this is post-industrial because when you start replacing all these factories, you just don't have any more industry, basically. You have different types of industry, but you don't have a manufacturing industry. And because of these factory closures, people get unemployed and start leaving the town in search of work, especially in small towns where they depend on factory for their jobs. Basically, when the factory closes down, all these people disperse to different cities to start looking for other work. But then that town, they start having less workers. They don't have any economic output, and then the town can just crash and just not exist anymore because all these businesses are closing down and the factories are closing down and no one wants to live there anymore. And on the other side, you can see a technopole, and this is basically a hub of information-based and high-tech companies with highly skilled workers. So this is Silicon Valley, and it is the biggest technopole in the United States, and it's home to companies such as Apple, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, all these powerhouse companies. And it has all these super highly skilled, highly paid workers that are really specialized and they're really influential. And some other technopoles in the United States include the Research Triangle, which is in North Carolina, where all these universities are, and in Boston, which is home to Harvard and MIT. So again, a lot of like research and development happening in those universities. Something related to technopoles are growth poles. So these are places with a high concentration of economic development. So these like concentrated areas where all these strong businesses are, they usually start attracting even more businesses, and it just turns into this economic like powerhouse area. And what happens there is a lot of economic growth. Obviously, they probably produce products that are really highly demanded and they're really important to society. And that just creates a growth pole, and people are usually attracted to these growth poles. Some benefits of a benefit of growth poles is that they can help communities that are far away, especially when they produce technology and products that can be used by a variety of people. So when they ship their products to communities far away, they are also positively impacted. And one bad effect or a backwash effect is brain drain. So this is when all these highly skilled, highly educated people leave a city and go somewhere else. So that city is left with basically like less educated people, and now their vital businesses are going to start closing down, and that moves into the next point of depopulation. When everyone starts leaving, I mean, a town has nothing really else to do when there's all these businesses are closing down because everyone starts moving out and towards a growth pole instead of staying in their small little towns and like vitalizing their economy. But the government can promote economic growth and development, and they can revitalize old small towns which had depopulation and brain drain occur to them. So they can use tax breaks, which is what we covered before, when they make businesses not have to pay taxes as an incentive to grow more. And then they also can provide loans, which a struggling business can use to reboost itself and get itself back on its feet, and then they can pay back eventually. And direct assistance, including subsidies, so they can, if you produce a certain amount of like a good product for economic growth, the government will give you a subsidy of a certain amount of money. And they can also change regulation. The government can make economic changes to regulations and make environmental laws more laid back. They can relax workers' rights, and that allows businesses to expand even more when they don't have those strict limits on pollution and litter and waste. So lastly, we will be doing a little fake news scenario. So on April 24th, 3030, an asteroid crashes into the United States. America has no more resources such as crops and technology because of the asteroid, but now they have an abundance of minerals and rocks from space. China has a lot of technology and food available to them, but they do not have space rocks at their disposal. Do you think that trade will take place between China and the United States? Apply your knowledge of complementarity and comparative advantage in your response. So just put your answers in the chat box and we will take a look at them. Okay, so I'm seeing people saying yes, and that is the correct answer. Trade will take place. And yes, okay, so this relates to complementarity because America wants China's technology and food, but China wants America's space rock. So trade is going to happen between the two. And I'm seeing, okay, comparative advantage. Yes. America has all this access to space rock because right in front of them when this asteroid crashed into Earth. And China already has all this tech and food. So they're both efficient at producing their respective products. So trade is going to happen. So great job. Okay, so that's it for today's stream. You can keep up with Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Thank you for being such a great audience.